Welcome to the International Express to Book Central, departing now. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. Hi there! Thank you for joining me today on the train to Book Central. I'm your host, Jules. Each week, while we travel along on this train, we will discuss a book or a short story or maybe a poem, and most definitely some medieval literature. I'll tell you something of the plot and then discuss some of my favorite aspects of whatever it is we just read. These episodes will of course contain heavy spoilers, as well as shock horror gasp, context and subtext, so be warned. Did you hear about the orcas and sharks currently taking on boats and yachts off the Iberian coast? Did the news of the lost Titan submersible fill you with a sense of dread as well? Do you both love and fear the deep-sea episodes of Attenborough's Planet Earth? Well, do I have a book for you? This week, a book took me into the depths. Or rather, it brought the potential horrors of the depths to me with a solid dose of space horror added to it. This week, we're talking about The Kraken Wakes by John Wyndham. I fell in love with this book about a year ago and recently reread it, not aware it would prove to be quite so suited to these crazy times. The Kraken Wakes is an apocalyptic science fiction novel, first published in 1953. Before I go into the plot and my discussion of it, I do want to give you a quick warning, as this episode will feature a discussion about suicidal ideation. While it will be brief, and while I will of course do my best to discuss it in a mindful way, it may still be difficult for some of you to engage with. Your health and happiness are much more important to me than a view or a like or a download, so if you think this book and this episode may not be for you, do join us for another one next week. The Kraken Wakes begins with a chapter called Rationale, which means the reason behind an action. And this little chapter starts thus. The nearest iceberg looked firmly grounded. Waves, with the whole fetch of the Atlantic behind them, exploded upon it, just as they would upon solid rock. Further out, there were other large bergs, also stranded by the falling tide, and looking like sudden white mountains. Here and there, among them, smaller ones were still afloat, with the wind and the current driving them slowly up the channel. That morning there were more, I fancy, than we had ever before seen at one time. I paused to look at them, blinding white crags in a blue sea. "I think," I said, "that I shall write an account of all this." "You mean a long one, about the whole thing? A book?" Phyllis asked. "Well, I don't suppose it will ever be a printed book, with stiff coverings and a cloth binding, but still, a book," I agreed. "I suppose a book is still a book, even if no one but the writer and his wife ever reads it," she said. Here we meet Mike Watson and his wife Phyllis, or Phil for short. Staring out at icebergs floating across the English Channel, Mike thinks that writing a book about all that has happened so far might be a good idea. As the two used to work as reporters, they gently bicker back and forth a little on the best way to go about writing such a book. Where to begin? Whether to structure it in chapters, as Mike thinks, or phases, which is suggested by Phil. Phil wins out in the end, and so we travel back in time to Phase 1, which finds Mike and Phil on their honeymoon years earlier aboard the ship the Guinevere. There they see what seems to be balls of fire falling into the sea, although no one aboard entirely agrees on how many they saw and if it was real. Being a reporter, Mike informs the EBC, or the English Broadcasting Company, for whom he works. Yes, the confusion between the fictional EBC and the real BBC is a running gag throughout the novel, and it actually remains funny. When Mike and Phil return from their honeymoon, he has been nicknamed Fireball Watson by his colleagues, as his report has triggered countless of letters from people seeing fireballs and other weird things in the sky. Most of these letters are admittedly of the wacky kind, but some are actually interesting. Eventually, though, the public interest in the fireballs kind of wanes, even as more and more of them seem to track across the sky all over the world. But nothing remains relevant forever, it seems, even if it might be important. But just as he's about to leave the fireballs behind, Mike is invited to the Admiralty, where Captain Winters shows him a map of all the fireballs that have landed until now. Not only are there way more than Mike suspected, but they have all landed in similar places, all in the water, all in the very deepest parts of the seas, which suggests some kind of plan. There's aliens, intelligent aliens, in the deep. Mike finagles himself and Phil invites onto a naval mission towards one of these deep trenches where fireballs have landed. A bathoscope, which is an underwater viewing device apparently, is sent down with 2 men, but in a way that feels a little too real right now, is destroyed shortly after one of the men aboard said he saw something weird. Admittedly, the men in the Titan didn't see anything weird, but they were also deep down there, so this hits a little bit hard now. After this whole debacle, which feels a little embarrassing to the Admiralty, the British government promptly sends down a nuclear bomb into the depths as punishment for the lost men. When the Americans do the same, disaster follows, as their bomb not only doesn't explode but seems to go missing, but also an entire ship gets dragged into the depths. Now ships begin sinking across the world, starting with a Japanese liner, making the oceans once again unsafe territory for humanity. Scientists are ridiculed for their ideas, and conspiracy theories begin to sprout. The economy threatens to tank due to the difficulties in trade, and of course national governments are unable to cooperate. America blames the USSR blames the capitalists, and meanwhile smaller nations get forgotten. And so starts Phase 2, with attacks upon Caribbean island nations by what appear to be sea tanks crawling onto the shore. Mike and Phil have become the go-to reporters on this topic for the EBC, so they become part of a team led by a scientist called Bocker, who has been solidly ridiculed by the media for his ideas on these, what he calls alien attacks. Together, they hop onto a plane to an island where Bocker expects an attack will take place. When he is eventually proven right, utter horror descends. Sea tanks crawl into the town square and shoot out a sticky and toxic net which grips painfully onto anything nearby that moves. The caught human prey, incapable of escape, is then dragged back into the ocean for some nefarious purpose, while the village becomes a ghost town. Phil is caught in the web and almost taken, while Mike himself is injured, but they do escape with their lives. Not only are they shaken by the implications of what has just happened, their lives have also changed irreversibly. It is undeniable that aliens are now on Earth, or in the sea. This experience also leads to a tragic but very important side plot. Phil seems more distant and distracted in the months after, frequently going to her cottage in Cornwall where she seems obsessed with home improvements. When a doctor checks up on Phil for exhaustion, it is revealed that it is actually Mike who has been struggling with night terrors and nightmares of Phil being hurt. During these night terrors, he becomes so distraught that he tries to kill or injure himself. He has no memory of these afterwards, but Phil has been saving him from himself each and every time. Mike is encouraged to go spend some time away from the news and the ongoing disaster at a country retreat, but when the attacks move from the tropics into northern Europe, he abandons rest and returns to London. When coastal communities begin to shore up their defenses, the attacks seem to slow down, but this is only the beginning of the third and final phase. Bocker and other scientists notice further strange phenomena, and it becomes clear that whatever is down there in the seas is drilling and terraforming. Slowly, but surely, The ice caps begin to melt, and the sea levels begin to rise. No need to attack on land, if there is no more land. This is another part of the book, which feels a little too real now. London gets flooded and panic erupts as the government hightails it out of there to a more hilly region. Communication networks break down, food becomes short, and looting and violence become common. Mike and Phil try to tough it out in London for as long as they can, but eventually they too have to flee. Military restrictions have been put in place and they are almost shot trying to cross into Cornwall. Eventually, they do find an abandoned dinghy and just about manage to escape to their cottage, which once lay on a hill and is now an island. It turns out Phil's home improvements mostly consisted of storing food and making the cottage a better refuge. It is here, in utter silence and isolation, with icebergs floating past, that Mike begins the book. The Kraken Wakes ends with a neighbor rowing his boat over to them, telling them the Japanese may have just invented a way to fight back. Mike and Phil are once again needed, and so they gather themselves, cautiously hopeful, for further confrontations with the deep. And that is the plot of The Kraken Wakes. Of course, there is so much more to it that I couldn't possibly put into better words than Wyndham himself. I guess you might just have to read the book after all to get the full experience. But before you do that, there are some more things I'd love to discuss with you. You see, science fiction is one of my all-time favorite genres, and in my opinion, it doesn't always get the respect it deserves. It is seen as complex and engaging, sure, but is it high literature? Does it actually have anything more to say than just, we'll have cool gadgets in the future? I think it does. Ursula K. Le Guin, an absolute giant in the field of science fiction, once wrote that science fiction isn't predictive in that it predicts where society will go, but rather descriptive, describing society as the author sees it in their own time, only transplanted elsewhere or with its appearance changed. Because of this, sci-fi, in my opinion, is a consistently human genre, no matter when or where it is written, or if some of the characters are technically aliens. What I mean by that is that the themes at play in sci-fi novels are based on ideas which play important roles in human society and around which huge debates take place. Because of this, sci-fi authors also often show a keen awareness of and insight into their own cultures, times, and societies. Reading sci-fi, for me at least, is often also an opportunity to think on some of these social issues, see them from a fresh perspective, and sometimes even change my mind. This is also true for John Wyndham's fiction, even if it sometimes gets dismissed as being pulp fiction. In fact, a British sci-fi novelist, Brian Aldiss, called Wyndham's work cozy catastrophes, which I personally, with all due respect to Aldiss, find ridiculous. The Kraken Wakes has an insanely high body count for one, and the global destruction it portrays is anything but cozy. There is an intimate feel to his book, yes, but that does not undercut the tension Wyndham, in my eyes at least, is able to create and sustain throughout. So I want to look at both of these aspects with you, the tension and the horror, as well as the humanity. First, the horror. Something I only found out while researching for this episode is that John Wyndham was a soldier during World War II and was apparently haunted by his experiences, the things he saw, and the things he became complicit in. In this way, he reminds me a little of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien fought in World War I and lost many of his friends to the war, and you can see how Tolkien's abhorrence of war and nationalism echoes throughout the high fantasy of The Lord of the Rings as well. These experiences shape a person, and knowing about Wyndham's past gives me a new appreciation of the way in which he depicts the breakdown of both his characters and the society around them. When Mike and Phil witness an attack, when they are hurt and in danger themselves during it, it changes things irrevocably and the threat becomes very real. As Wyndham's own war experiences shaped his outlook, so his two characters are changed by their experiences. Even when back home others still do not see the threat, they do, and it becomes something they can no longer avoid. While reading The Kraken Wakes, I was very affected by the way Mike's trauma is described. Initially, you are a little wrong-footed, because the novel is narrated from his point of view, and so, along with him, you worry about Phil and whether she has been traumatized. When it flips, and it is revealed that it is actually him that has been suffering, screaming, and attempting to hurt himself, I gently had to put the book down for a second. It is so unexpected, and yet it speaks perfectly to the way in which many of us might deal with such difficult experiences. We push the memories away, we keep going, and we're absolutely fine, except that we aren't. There was such a quiet horror to this, to the fact that Mike was so unaware of his own trauma, and that Phil was absolutely exhausted of trying to help him without shattering his sense of self. It is this which makes me scoff, again with apologies, at Aldiss's idea that this is cozy. It is deeply emotional, yes, and there is a lot of comfort and humor in the relationship between Mike and Phil, but it's also difficult. Alexandra Kleeman, in an excellent introduction to The Kraken Wakes, writes that, quote, "Few books capture the obscure elliptical way that threats move from the background to the foreground of reality, like The Kraken Wakes," end quote. I couldn't agree with her more. Throughout the first phase, and even part of the second phase of the alien presence on Earth, we see how the threat is still very much a background thing for most people. Sure, there's weird fireballs in the sky, but did you see how expensive tomatoes were? And sure, a Japanese ship sunk, but who knows how good their craftsmanship was anyway? And sure, different governments are saying different things, but what else is new? For most of the beginning, the potential danger is so far in the back of people's minds that they don't even realize a threat could materialize. It becomes very vivid and real, however. And of course, this is especially the case for our protagonists, but through them, Wyndham also brings the experiences of other people closer. Another element Alexandra Kleeman was able to describe a lot better than me was the way in which Wyndham was, quote, attentive to the ecology of disaster, not just the disastrous event, but its causal webwork, the way large events reverberate at minute scales, and the myriad perspectives contained within, end quote. The novel gives us a variety of different ideas and opinions, from the scientific to the conspiracy theory. It gives us direct insight into key events, but also how they affect friendships. The book shows how countries are affected, but also how international political issues can stand in the way of global solutions, or how the impact on trade echoes throughout a society. Considering this wide web, it is also worth thinking of how alien invasion novels, especially those written in the UK during the late 19th and 20th century, but also those written in America during the Cold War, showed an awareness of imperialism and its consequences. In the way that H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds can be read as a response to colonialism, so I think can The Kraken Wakes be read as a post-colonial novel that responds to the slow collapse of the British Empire. From a post-colonial perspective, it asks what it would be like to be invaded by something you do not understand, whose way of life is so utterly different to yours, and who seem determined to claim their space in your territory. From a slow collapse perspective, it shows how easily a society is undermined and how little things like national pride or national character mean in the face of a serious threat. In that way, the novel also still holds up a mirror to us today. The Kraken Wakes is a story about survival, but unlike some other disaster survival stories, Wyndham goes all the way. The descriptions of attacks, losses, and confrontations are really gripping, and for once this disaster doesn't strike just the West. I bring this up in relation to my previous point. So much of how the world deals with crisis in The Kraken Wakes reminded me of how we still mess around today when it comes to global threats like a pandemic or climate change. The infighting between countries, the way parts of the media and certain political movements collaborate to gain an audience, the way that messages get confused, the way scientists get brought in and then dismissed, it all felt very familiar. Admittedly, the 1950s aren't that long ago, especially if you take into account the entirety of human history, but it's nonetheless confronting to see how we not only still deal with these things, but still haven't found solutions to it. But to move from the horror to the human. What I love the Kraken Wakes for is Phyllis, and the way her relationship with Mike is depicted. She is a delightful character. So delightful, in fact, she made me wonder whether Wyndham had a partner of his own who was also such a delight. It turns out that less than 10 years before his death, he married Grace Wilson, who he had known for over 20 years at that point. I do hope she was his Phyllis. The way Mike and Phil work together, their banter and casual sniping, the way they deeply care for each other but remain whole, separate, individual people, it all came together to really make me care. There is a kindness and companionship in their relationship, which I think often gets overlooked, even in some romances. These two characters are quite simply really good friends, as well as a husband and wife, and an excellent work team. Mike knows when to let Phil take the lead, and simultaneously Phil also understands when it's Mike who knows what to do. They also infuse a certain ease and humor into the narrative, which helps to occasionally break the tension. The fact that despite everything that's happening, these two somehow keep going brings a certain kind of hope into the narrative, which I can't help but appreciate. What also really sets the Kraken Wakes apart for me was that it's not just great sci-fi, but also that so much of the book is about how to tell a story. Literally, the opening is Mike and Phil arguing about the best way to start and structure the book, what quotes to put at the beginning, etc. Being journalists, they are often concerned about what they're saying and whether they're communicating the right thing. It was really interesting to see how Wyndham described their process, from them witnessing things to them working through them and then reporting on them. It aided both in the complexity of the novel, but also added to its humanity. How do you put certain things into words? Can you ever fully explain what it is that you saw? And what about the things you don't know but do fear? How do you explain those? Because there is such a focus on how to say things, it also becomes clear how much isn't said. Whether it's Mike's night terrors, which we never actually witness directly, or the alien creatures under the sea, which are never described except when they come on land. There are significant gaps because no one person can see or understand or explain everything. This might be frustrating for some readers, which I absolutely understand. But for me, it felt quite realistic. Most of us don't understand many of the things that happen in our everyday life, whether it's the details behind how my phone is connecting to the Wi-Fi or why my plants refuse to thrive even though I water them. And this also goes quite well with the science part of science fiction. Sometimes the science can be a little overwhelming, especially when you, as in me, are not as familiar with, say, the structure of DNA as maybe you should be. The Kraken Wakes has quite a bit of science, but again we get to hear this through the ears of Mike and Phil. As reporters, they know what questions to ask, when to double-check, and when to let an academic just babble on. I work in academia, so I think I'm allowed to say that. While many things remain mysterious, such as the appearance of the aliens, we do get potential theories and information about many other things, all presented in a way which, at least for me, was manageable and interesting. And so we come to the final thing I want to talk about, which is the question that runs throughout not just the Kraken Wakes, but almost all of Wyndham's alien fiction, or at least through the ones that I've read. This question is whether two intelligent species, one of them us humans and the other something new and alien, could coexist on one planet. Would we as humans be capable of allowing another intelligent species to live alongside us? Or would we feel an irresistible urge to destroy them because their intelligence formed a threat to our survival? I think Wyndham leans more towards the destruction rather than the coexistence. A lot of our behavior would suggest that he was right to think this, as we seem hardly capable of coexisting with each other and the animal species already here. On the other hand, I also think humanity is capable of incredible insight and effort and beauty. So many people are working so very hard at the moment to improve the ways in which we engage with each other, with the planet, and with the animals on it. While Wyndham perhaps was a little more skeptical of humanity than I am, probably with good reason, he nonetheless also leaves space for some hope, for a brighter day. And I think that's something we can all use. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.